there's been people talking about, okay, if we make Bitcoin quantum proof in the future, what should we do with old addresses which don't move coins? So, Satoshi's coins, for example, should we let somebody steal them using quantum computing, or should we make it that old addresses can't be spent anymore? That question alone proves there is some kind of trust involved. A lot of people were freaking out, and I'm just kind of sitting there going, okay, let's carry on building things, let's carry on making interesting stuff, and it's just another cycle. So I don't see any concerns with that. It's kind of interesting that you say most of your transactions are on chain, because when I look at my personal usage, I get paid on chain. There's a couple of larger things which I will pay on chain, but the vast majority of my Bitcoin usage, my sort of daily spending usage, is Lightning transactions. So another reason that you might want to switch to Lightning for a couple of things, it's the speed at which you can do that is incredible.
Hi Ben, how are you doing? Everything fine on your end?
Yeah, things are good. Thanks for having me back on.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's super interesting because I think the first time is always like to get to know each other, but the second time you can like dive a little bit deeper and like already know like what are kind of the topics and what are kind of the things. And I asked you before of like, what are kind of like the most important things or like the things that are most present in your brain? And it's always really hard to answer that. I asked that like more and more of my guests because there's so many things happening in Bitcoin. We also have that feeling that there is like, one Bitcoin year is like 10 normal years almost. And so I will just ask you, like, how has it been for you in Bitcoin since you've last been on the podcast? I think like, I don't know, half a year or something like that ago.
Yeah. So I'd say, things are good in general. I'm not one of these people who pays too much attention to the exchange rate between Bitcoin and fiat. So there was that relatively large drop recently, and a lot of people were freaking out, and I'm just kind of sitting there going, okay, let's carry on building things, let's carry on making interesting stuff, and it's just another cycle. So I don't see any concerns with that. Overall, I think some of the more interesting things happening in Bitcoin recently have been sort of some of the quieter things, some of the things that not so many people talk about. The Lightning network continues to grow. Lots more people sort of starting to use Lightning, which probably indicates a lot more use of merchant adoption as well, because obviously those two things kind of go together quite a lot. Beyond that, I've been to a couple of conferences recently and seen some interesting ideas, some people doing sort of fun things with Bitcoin. I'm always a big fan of interesting use cases which aren't damaging to Bitcoin, but potentially using Bitcoin in interesting ways. So, open timestamps, for example, is one of those, and I think there's a couple of interesting projects going on there as well.
It's so fun because I just talked with Knut, and he was also like, it's just money, and he specifically mentioned timestamping as the only thing that he's like, that is the only thing that he's like, yeah, that there's a use case in there, and we also call Bitcoin, the blockchain, the time chain. And I actually started a live stream, and now I also do every single live stream just for fun to have that reference, the block height, the exchange rate, as well as like the exchange rate for the one way is fun having like one Bitcoin, how much US dollar is it? But I think it's way more fun to look at how many Satoshis can you buy for just like $1 US. I think this is like the more fun exchange rate. I like to look at it, like seeing the number actually going down and approaching one. I think now we had like 1,100 or something like that. But it's interesting that you mentioned also time stamping, because the time chain has something, like if you think about the different time zones and this calendar things that we have going on and how hard it is to coordinate times with block time, it's really fun. We live through that every time in the halving when we all kind of celebrate at the same moment. Is there like a deeper thing that can actually happen with the block time, with the block height, and the time chain?
Yeah, so I actually think block heights are a really interesting way to measure time, because they're not perfectly aligned with time. They happen on average every 10 minutes, but that doesn't mean that they actually happen every 10 minutes. But you can very much tie a block height to a particular point in time in the past. You can't necessarily do that for the future. But what that means is you can so you mentioned, I mentioned, and then you re-mentioned timestamping. I think that's a really interesting use case of the fact that a block height has a particular time, and you can record data in it and then prove that that data happened and hasn't been changed since, and so on. Occasionally you can use it for just sort of fun little things. So my daughter, for example, knows the block height she was born at. It's block height 117523. My son was born at block height 295307. So having block heights as timestamps of a particular thing which happened in the past is sort of a nice way to look at it. One of the companies I used to work at, we used to even on Slack would say things like, I'll be gone for about 3 blocks. So, if you're disappearing for about 30 minutes, you just say, I'll be gone for 3 blocks. So that's kind of, once you get used to talking in that kind of way, it actually kind of starts to make some sense. Yeah.
I just realized there are now people that have a good amount of age that are born in the block time age, because like Bitcoin is now 16 years old, and so you're like, if you're like under that age, if you're 15, 14, 12, 10, 8 or something like that, you're like, you can actually say like, I was born at that block, which is very specific. Like you like that very block, maybe it's like a very specific time that you can actually look up. And I like things like the time chain calendar. I love those tools because like you actually can input date or like a block and see exactly when it was. But it's a really, really interesting thing. With you, it's also interesting for me because you live the most fully on a Bitcoin standard from people I know, especially not in El Salvador, not in any of those regions, but like just in, I think, the UK. We've talked about that last time. How has it been for you to live on a full Bitcoin standard, especially because I think in the audience, there's probably only like maybe 2%, maybe 1% that actually do with what you're already doing, like just like living as close to Bitcoin standard as possible.
So, yeah, it's got its ups and downs. I think one of the challenges moving to the UK actually has been that there are less places around me now that accept Bitcoin than when I lived in Germany. When I was living in Germany, I was relatively close to the Czech border, and I could drive to Prague, which is a great place for spending Bitcoin. But here in the UK, actually, there's almost nowhere in the city that I'm living in, which allows me to pay in Bitcoin directly. So I am using a lot more of kind of the middle layers. So essentially things whereby I spend fiat, or I spend something denominated in fiat and then pay it off, like my credit card, or using gift card type things such as from Bitrefill. So there's a lot more of that now than there was when I was living in Germany, but I still, I essentially still do live on the Bitcoin standard, simply in that, my income is in Bitcoin, my holdings are in Bitcoin. Fiat is just a medium of exchange in between.
I love that, and this is the way it's been done. And even if I think even if you have fiat income, I mean, if you have fiat income, it's harder because then you have to pay exchange rates for getting it into Bitcoin and then getting it out of Bitcoin, and then you're like you can just like spend the fiat directly and kind of save on the exchange rate. So I get that argument, but if you start earning in Bitcoin, it's a whole game changer. You mentioned the Lightning Network, and I think it's, weirdly enough, the most underreported topic on my podcast, like probably also because I myself like still do everything on chain when I earn and spend in Bitcoin, outside of small things, like outside, like we had in Bulgaria that game where we have to buy the entry in Lightning, or when I go to Vienna meetups, which doesn't happen too often, I pay in Lightning for my burger. Those of course is very inconvenient for on-chain, but most of the things I do is on-chain. So how would you say is like the Bitcoin Lightning adoption going? And you said like it's growing nicely and it's actually going good.
Yeah. So I don't have any statistics sort of in front of me, but the Bitcoin Lightning Network has definitely been growing a lot. I saw some stats recently, can't remember them off the top of my head, but the overall number of sats on public channels has been increasing. The number of nodes has been increasing. So I think and the channel size, average channel size has also been increasing quite a lot. So, there's a lot more large channels appearing, which really makes it look to me like people are ramping up the usage of it. So it's not just, small channels for playing around or, doing tiny transactions to just, try it out or whatever, but people are actually establishing channels for serious monetary usage. It's kind of interesting that you say, most of your transactions are on chain, because when I look at my personal usage, I get paid on chain. There's a couple of larger things which I will pay on chain, but the vast majority of my Bitcoin usage, my sort of daily spending usage, is Lightning transactions. So, if I'm using Bitrefill to buy, a gift card, for example, that will be a Lightning transaction. When I pay off my Australian credit card using Living Room with Satoshi, that's over Lightning. So, and that can even be relatively large amounts sometimes. So I might pay, 2,000, 3,000 Australian dollar credit card bill on Lightning. So, it's kind of interesting to sort of see that difference there, because I could use on-chain for that as well, but I just prefer to use Lightning because that's where my funds are sitting.
And I think there's an important difference in my thing. I have still a fiat income. So like I have, I don't know, 60, 70% in Bitcoin and the rest in fiat, something like that. I don't know the exact split. And so I try really hard to use the fiat income to fiat bills and the Bitcoin for Bitcoin bills. And then hopefully there's just like some profit laying around that like just keeps easing Bitcoin. And so it usually doesn't work out like that. I usually have to sell some Bitcoin to cover some fiat bills, which I usually do like once a month maybe, or like once every second month. So I use like a big chunk of Bitcoin and convert it into fiat, and like I have again fiat to pay some bills, which is like then very different, because then it's like always like at least $1,000, maybe $2,000 or $3,000. And so I think if I have everything directly in Bitcoin, I probably would start making more serious moves to have like a Lightning wallet for direct spending. There's then also like cards that you can connect to your Lightning wallet that you can like almost instantly use to buy things like Visa and MasterCards. I haven't used any of those. Have you used like those cards where you basically connected with a Lightning wallet?
So I haven't looked into them in a while. I sort of tried some of the earlier options that were available to me at the time, and my general approach was I don't like them because they're custodial. That said, though, there was one card from a company that no longer exists called LastBit, and what they allowed was the ability to do a Lightning transaction to the custodial wallet and then have it immediately available on the card. So I could walk into a supermarket, maybe go to the checkout. It's going to cost me €50, and then at that point, I transfer exactly the right amount of sats over to that custodial wallet and then tap the card and it just works. So it uses the funds on there. So that was a good approach. That company no longer exists, as I said, but they are essentially, or the spiritual successor of that company is a company called Bring In, a European company, and Bring In, I'm a huge fan of their work. So, not a sponsor or anything, but, definitely, a very happy customer of theirs. I don't have their card yet, but, I'm going to be getting it soon and sort of playing around with that. So, that could be essentially the thing that I want to try next.
Yeah, I know of Bring In the card. Bring In is also a great service that I sometimes use to exchange it quickly, because it's like you can literally go from fiat in your bank account. No, like I've never tried it actually that way. I always try like from Bitcoin on my self-custodial wallet on chain to fiat in my bank account within like 15 minutes. So it's like super, super fast because you have instant SEPA and all of that. Like you just like pay the QR code. I love the experience. Like it's super freaking fast. But I think Wave.space, I haven't looked into them too much, but I think they are self-custodial. I might be wrong here. I heard about them, that they have a self-custodial, Lightning wallet where you directly get it from your Master and Visa card and you can spend it, but I'm not sure of that. And then we just recently had Philip on from Chainfree, is it called? Yeah. And they have the Dolphin card, like the Aqua wallet thing, the which is apparently non-KYC, but I haven't used any of those, so I'm just pouring out cards.
It's interesting you mentioned 15 minutes is fast. Yeah, for on-chain that is. So bring in, I could, if I wanted, get fiat into my bank account from Bitcoin in a matter of about 2 minutes with a Lightning transaction. So send the Lightning transaction, wait for the SEPA, confirm it, and it's done. Like it's amazingly fast, and that works both directions if you're using Lightning. So I think that's one of the really nice things with the way Bringen have set up their service. So another reason that you might want to switch to Lightning for a couple of things, it's the speed which you can do that is incredible. Yeah.
That is very true. Do you still see hurdles for the Lightning adoption, and still see hurdles for like that being the main thing?
Yes, but I think they're different hurdles than probably most people are looking at. So most of the time people think of the hurdles for Lightning as being the complexity. Running your own node is not particularly easy. There's a lot of sort of things you need to think about there. But I do think a lot of that complexity is kind of pushed away by some of what I'd call the non-custodial but managed for you services. So there's a lot of Lightning wallets out there which are not custodial. You hold your own keys, but somebody else is essentially running the node and doing the channel management and all that sort of thing for you. Those services remove the vast majority of the complexity, and they're basically ridiculously simple to use. They're as easy to use as a custodial wallet in all reality. The only difference being that you do have to back up your keys, which is a good thing to do. So I don't see that as being as much of a hurdle as most other people do. I don't think the complexity is something we need to worry about. That's just a matter of UX, which solves itself over time. Where I see more hurdles for Lightning is in the in the broader adoption of it, in terms of just getting channels open for everyone. If you wanted to all of a sudden onboard even just a city the size of London, let's get everybody in the city of London onto Lightning with their own channels. There's a huge amount of on-chain traffic associated with just that. There are ways around it. So, you can do various kinds of batch opens. So you have a single transaction, which is opening multiple channels. You can, do kind of special tricks around that. But I think we do need some additional things that are going to make this easier. So we need maybe some kind of new opcodes on Bitcoin to enable certain things that we can't do at the moment in order to open channels in a more elegant way. I saw some interesting research proposals around things like multi-party channels, whereby rather than just a channel being between two people, you've got a channel between X number of people. There's kind of a lot of complexity there, and it also probably works better with new opcodes. So I think those are the kinds of challenges we're actually going to face. Assuming Lightning becomes the best way to sort of make payments directly, how do we onboard that number of people? Then the second thing around Lightning is that Lightning requires a connection at all times. Most of the time. Lightning requires that you actually be online to make a payment or receive a payment. That isn't everyone everywhere. In a lot of the world, you don't necessarily have a connection. Even in, nice Western civilization where you have a connection most of the time. I was in a restaurant which had a downstairs area. They accepted Bitcoin, but I went down there and my phone had no signal, so I couldn't make a payment in Bitcoin but without connecting to their Wi-Fi, which turned out to be like this big, long, complicated procedure. So simple little things like that also make Lightning harder to use than it potentially otherwise could be. If you think of things like how a credit card payment works, the receiver needs to have some kind of online connection at some point. So it doesn't even need to be immediate. It needs to be immediate if you want to do various checks and things. But overall, you can take a credit card payment in a completely offline scenario and then push the data later, or only the receiver is online and it can do all of the checks and things. You don't need your credit card to be online. I think that's where things like Cashew can come in. So eCash implementations, Cashew, or potentially even things like Fediment, where you've got eCash tokens where only one party needs to be online in order to actually do a transfer. So I think that actually plays an interesting role, maybe with sort of that at the front end, and then Lightning being the rails between various eCash providers. Overall, though, I think it's one of those things which just needs to play out, and we need to see how things evolve. But I am very interested in those as sort of additional technologies added on around Lightning.
This is really interesting. I mean, Jeff Booth also talks about Fediments and like federations on top of Lightning, and this is something I probably haven't really looked into at all. Like I've looked into it, but like all the time I spent in there was like so little that I don't even want to say that I looked into it a little bit. For me and for probably also most of the audience, what are federations and what are and Cashews and Fedi and all the providers in there, and what kind of role are they playing with the Lightning network?
I think there's kind of two things to cover there then. One is what is eCash, which is what Cashew is, and also what Fediment provides, but then also what is a federation, because Fediment is a federated eCash mint. So eCash itself is basically a bearer token which represents the amount of money. So it's tricky to define it in terms of what most Bitcoiners would think of as custodial or non-custodial. The control of what's called the mint is somewhat centralized. So you've got a certain service, which is the mint, and it generates these tokens. It can give out the tokens to people. So maybe I will send it 500 sats over Lightning, and it gives me back a 500 sat eCash token. That token is basically just a bit of data. I could give you that bit of data completely offline, so I don't need to talk to some online service to give it to you. I just physically give you that token, copy it over to your computer, send it in an email, send it in a text message, whatever the case would be. And then what you can do is essentially send that to the mint and say, I now own this token, I've got this token, which kind of then stops me from being able to then give it to anyone else because you've claimed it. You've done the receiving side of it. So in order to send that to you, I didn't need to be online. So essentially it removes the necessity for both parties to be online. The mint doesn't necessarily even know who it knows the token is valid. It knows it's a certain amount, but it's not really capable of keeping track of, who it was. So this token could pass hands multiple times, and there's a lot of sort of blinding going on there. So the mint isn't aware. It can't kind of track people and follow transactions around. So it's also quite good for privacy, unlike a lot of other systems. So that's the idea of eCash. eCash, by the way, originally was actually came up with as an idea outside of the Bitcoin world. So the original idea was you could have this kind of eCash system for, dollars, for example. So a bank could be an eCash mint and it's giving out these digital dollars, which can be handed around and then, used in that kind of way. It didn't really take off as such, but I think Bitcoin gave it a new lease on life. It gave it the ability for the tokens to be more meaningfully used because it can be used alongside things like Lightning. So it's very easy to kind of move in and out of this token-based approach, using Lightning kind of as the back-end rails between all of the other systems. So yeah, that's Cashew, or eCash in general, and Cashew is kind of the main, I'd say Cashew is one of the better, straightforward, simple implementations. Very nice, major implementation of it. The other big one, of course, though, is Fediment, which I think a lot of people have heard of. The difference with Fediment compared to Cashew is that Fediment attempts to use a federated mint model. So instead of the mint, the thing which is creating these tokens, being a centralized service, it's essentially managed by a federation of people. So it requires a group of people to come together and sign things in order for stuff to happen. So rather than just relying on one person running the mint or one organization running the mint, you can kind of spread the load across multiple people, and it theoretically reduces the amount of trust necessary. It complicates the back-end setup, but it reduces the trust that's necessary. And I think the Fediment company have actually done a fairly good job of obfuscating a lot of that complexity. So they've made it actually quite nice to, join a federation, leave a federation, all that sort of thing in their software.
And so there's like two different things then. The thing is for me, like how we scale Bitcoin, I think the main layer will be quite expensive and busy. And so if you want to buy a home, maybe that's good on-chain, depending on like what time frame we're talking about. But if you want to buy something in the store, you use like Lightning or one of the Cashew or like a Federation, like a Fediment implementation. I always think about how important is it on the most upper layer to have still full control of those Bitcoins, because like you have to give up some how should I say it, sovereignty, some decentralization aspect of it. I think that's the best way, like the more you move, the less decentralized and secure it gets, and the more like scalable it gets, like the trilemma thing. And I'm not sure how much we even need on like the daily spending thing. Like there's like, I'm okay if there is, I'm even okay if there's like a wallet where there's like $100 or $1,000 in there, that is, kind of could coerce the wallet or could, do something negative with that, because it's just like a wallet. Like it's okay for me. And because I have the option of like keeping it, on chain or keeping it, in Lightning, and beyond that, it's like, how much do you care about the decentralization and security? Is that fair?
Yeah. I think that is relatively fair. So it's not always the case that moving up layers removes certain or increases the amount of trust that's necessary. So I'd say what it does instead is it changes some of the trust assumptions. So I gave a talk a while back, a few years ago. It unfortunately wasn't recorded, but it was actually one of my better talks, I think. It was called "Nothing is Trustless." And I think there's a common misconception in the Bitcoin world that Bitcoin is a completely trustless system. You don't need to trust anything or anyone at all. That's not actually true. There are trust assumptions. They just tend to be very broad with Bitcoin. So, if you had the vast majority of the network conspiring against you, so everyone in the world decides, we don't like Robin, we're not going to process his on-chain transactions anymore, then your on-chain transactions wouldn't get processed. If all of the miners said, oh, we're going to try and identify transactions that come from Robin and then stop them, they potentially could stop your transactions. There's always a bit of a cat and mouse game there with you trying to create new secret wallets that they don't know about and so on. But, there is still, nevertheless, some kind of trust assumption going on there. Or if, the vast majority of the network all of a sudden decided that we wanted to change the rules to be something different, change the consensus rules, then that could be done. There's been people talking about, okay, if we make Bitcoin quantum proof in the future, what should we do with old addresses which don't move coins? So, Satoshi's coins, for example, should we let somebody steal them using quantum computing, or should we make it that old addresses can't be spent anymore? That question alone proves there is some kind of trust involved. You have to trust that the rest of the network isn't going to conspire against your holdings. So that's kind of the base layer. Then any layer you put on top has other kinds of trust assumptions associated with it. You've got Lightning has certain trust assumptions largely around the ability to be online and actually watch over your status. Things like watchtowers can help with that, but then you have to trust that the watchtowers aren't colluding against you. Then there's things like Arc, which have different kinds of trust assumptions. I think Arc is a very interesting technology and has it's attempting to reduce a lot of those trust assumptions, but it is still, this secondary layer. So there are points in time where the coordination system of Arc can be, gamed in some ways. But very, very, again, very, very sort of niche, attack vectors against it. So you usually don't have to kind of worry. But then, as you get to sort of further up, you do get to things like custodial systems, whereby you're simply completely trusting a third party. And I personally don't think there is anything wrong with picking what level of trust you are comfortable with and which trust assumptions you are willing to make for different kinds of transactions and for different amounts of money. Would I trust a custodial system with my life savings? Absolutely not. That would be ridiculous. So my life savings are under my control in a completely offline, cold storage wallet with certain layers of security around it, which it's better not to talk about on a podcast. So, I've got, my cold storage is pretty safe. But then, my daily spending wallet, it's a Lightning wallet. It's, running on a node, which is sitting in my house. Somebody could come into my house and steal that node. Somebody could come into, physically steal the node that I've got. They could, access it remotely. Maybe there's some kind of security vulnerability. It's a hot wallet, so, maybe they can get access to those funds that way. So there are certain things that I'm willing to accept for different levels of money that's actually being spent.
It's interesting because it's a little bit of a different topic now, but there's this debate that people are like, no, a hot wallet is so insecure, but I like actually hot wallets for spending and receiving because I like it to be anyways on my phone. There's never a huge amount in there. It's basically would you be comfortable holding that amount of money also in your wallet, like in your, how to say it, like a physical wallet where you put your, I actually have it here, in those kind of wallets. If you are comfortable with those kind of wallets, amounts of money in there, you can also be comfortable with holding it on your phone. And actually, it's on your phone, it's a lot more secure because maybe you need Face ID to get in your phone and all of that. And maybe you have on your hot wallet a backup at home. So even if you lose your phone, you can still access your funds and all of those things. So it's it's in theory a lot more safe than an actual physical wallet and putting notes in there. But I always say hot wallets are an amazing thing in Bitcoin, so you can actually use it. Don't put your life savings on there, but use it as a spending wallet. Use it as a wallet that you can actually use. And as soon as pretty soon after I started earning Bitcoin, I was I need to get a hot wallet, just on my phone. So I can use it. There's not a lot of Bitcoin on there. So if I lose it, it's okay. But I need the convenience of that. And you can also do it with a hardware wallet. You can also do different things, but then you cannot do it, when you're not outside, or you have to always take the hardware wallet with you. And then it's you can also just take the phone then with you. It's I love hot wallets. They are people speak too bad about them, I feel like.
Yep, no, I agree completely. I mean, every Lightning wallet is a hot wallet, and Lightning is my preferred method of spending money. So I am using a hot wallet pretty much all the time. Again, I agree. I don't put my life savings on there. My life savings stay in that cold storage, but my hot wallet it's got enough that I can spend, and it's also sort of the amount that if I were to lose it suddenly, I wouldn't be destitute or in problems.
Maybe just to clarify for the people that are wondering about it, because I always want to make sure that if new people are in the podcast also understand that why we even need layers on Bitcoin. As I understand it, and please correct me, we cannot facilitate everything on chain because Bitcoin has to scale through layers. Otherwise, we risk losing decentralization and security. And so to get scalability and even privacy to a certain extent, we are scaling on layers, as a quick summary.
Exactly, yeah. So the Bitcoin base layer, approximately once every 10 minutes, sort of on average, every 10 minutes, a new block is found. That block is capable of holding up to, let's call it 4 megabytes of data, but it can be sort of around 1, depending on the type of data which is going in there. the data that it stores are transactions. Now, a Bitcoin transaction varies in size depending on how many different inputs and outputs it has. That's kind of a technical thing, but let's say you sent me, Bitcoin 5 times to my wallet, and then I want to spend it all out to somebody else. I'm going to have 5 inputs and 1 output on that transaction because, you sent to me 5 times and I send out, and there's, 1 transaction going out. So, the size of the size of a transaction will change depending on the number of inputs and outputs, but you can roughly figure it at sort of somewhere around 200 to 250 bytes. And, it can go up significantly from there for, much larger transactions with lots of inputs and lots of outputs. The amount being sent doesn't really change the size of the transaction. It's just the, number of inputs, number of outputs, the type of signature it has, and, any special conditions around it. So you can send very large amounts of Bitcoin in very small transactions, or you can send small amounts of Bitcoin in relatively large transactions, from a data perspective size. But if those transactions are 200 to 250 bytes and you can only hold, let's say, somewhere between 1 and 4 megabytes of data in the block, you can fairly quickly figure out, how many transactions actually fit into a block and and if they come every 10 minutes, you can kind of work it out on a per second basis. If you do all of the maths, it comes out to somewhere around 7 to 10, I think, transactions per second that the Bitcoin network could handle. There's a lot of caveats to that number, and people often quote that number to say, Bitcoin is not capable of scaling properly or whatever. But that's, FUD, basically. But what you can then do is use some of those transactions to instead send money onto what you can call another layer. So Lightning is the most popular one of that, and it's also probably one of the easier ones to understand. What you do with Lightning is you create a transaction that goes out to a new type of a new address, which is really kind of a holding address. That holding address contains all of the funds that you put into it, and now it's going to pay out all of those funds back to you if you now spend a new transaction from that address. Instead of doing that immediately, though, what you do is you agree with somebody else. It's initially going to pay out all of the funds to me, and it's going to pay out 0 to them. But I want to give them some money. So what I do is I say, okay, I will update this transaction and not broadcast it to the network, whereby now most of it comes back to me, but some of it goes to you. So we've updated the transaction without sending it to the network. Later, they want to send me some money, so we update that transaction again. We can update that transaction as many times as we want without ever sending it to the network, and it represents the amount that's going to my channel partner, so to you, and the amount that comes back to me. Where that then gets really interesting is if I have that arrangement with multiple people, let's call them Alice, Bob, and Carol. Alice can send a transaction to Carol without having a channel directly to her if Bob has a transaction with both of them. So Alice and Bob update their mutual transaction, Bob and Carol update their mutual transaction, and now everybody has the right amount of money. So it's there's a lot of kind of cryptographic stuff which goes on behind the scenes to make sure that you can't cheat that, because obviously, you don't want somebody sending an old status or saying, hey, I updated it even though they really didn't. All of those kinds of things need to be provable. So there's a bunch of stuff that we probably don't need to go into on the technical side to make sure that that happens. But that's essentially how the Lightning Network works. So then instead of saying you've got 7 to 10 transactions per second with Bitcoin, Lightning allows you to have potentially unlimited, because all you're doing is updating these statuses between two people without ever writing anything to the Bitcoin chain.
It's super interesting. I love your explanations. Like it, I don't know if I think I've told you that in Bulgaria, but you always make sense for me. It's like when you explain something for me. One thing I haven't heard you talk about a lot, maybe I've never heard you talk about that, but you probably have talked about it, is, and I'm curious on your take actually, how do you look at Bitcoin treasury companies?
I think a company which is being a Bitcoin treasury company purely for the purpose of being a Bitcoin treasury company, as in they do nothing else, or the other things that they do are essentially useless, besides holding Bitcoin and getting people to speculate on it, those are dangerous in a lot of ways, and I think they are just speculative, hype things. They allow somebody to get exposure to Bitcoin's exchange rate without necessarily having to hold Bitcoin themselves. There are some legal reasons you might want to do that in some jurisdictions. There are some things like some kinds of pension funds which could hold the stock of a company which is doing that but can't hold Bitcoin directly. So it gives you exposure to Bitcoin's value without doing that. But I think they tend to, I think we've actually seen a few of them already, tend to pump up quite high and then fall down in value quite quickly. And it's kind of it's the exact same hype cycle that you see with altcoins and that sort of thing. It's just this speculative bubble, and I think that's quite dangerous. That said, I think any company should want to hold Bitcoin on its balance sheet because Bitcoin is a better form of money. In the same way that every person should want to hold Bitcoin, every company should as well. So I think every company should have a Bitcoin treasury. But being a Bitcoin treasury company and having a Bitcoin treasury are not necessarily the same thing. You could even have a company which holds quite a lot of Bitcoin, and some people might begin to speculate on it in the same sort of ways as they would with those others. The difference would be that the company is still doing something meaningful and valuable. It still has a reason to be beyond that it holds Bitcoin. So that's sort of my broad take on it. I think there are some nuances there as well. I think, especially in the case of, for example, Bitcoin companies which do things with Bitcoin, are probably more useful as a company which has a large amount of Bitcoin and people are speculating on it, because the point of that company should also be to increase the value of Bitcoin. So it makes sense that their holdings are then also in Bitcoin.
Yeah, I love that, because I basically have a very similar view. I think there's like 3 different types of treasury companies. The first type, and I hate that name, but the treasury guys call it like that, is the pure play. So like they just have Bitcoin, and I'm like, I don't know if it's pure or just like speculation. And so because they only do that, then there are the companies that are having a profitable operating business. Actually, there's like a 4th type. There's like the second type that has the profitable business and they just like stack Bitcoin. Then there are the hybrid things where they do have an operating business. It's like the third category for me. But the operating business is very small. Like it doesn't really like. I think Metaplanet comes to my mind because what they have like one hotel or like maybe now a second or something like that. I've not done any deep research on that company. But then, they aspire to be something way bigger. And I'm like, okay, it's like a very small operating business already enough. And then I think in its own category for me, strategy, for 2 reasons. First, like, to start with, they were already a good company, like a bigger company that is around for a long time with a now no longer CEO, but still chairman with Seyr that has been around for a very long time in that sphere with a lot of knowledge and experience. It's not just like some random guy that like made a treasury company because it's cool. He made it when it wasn't cool. And the first move advantage of like having now over 600,000 Bitcoin, or maybe already 700,000. I don't know. And so I'm very clear that the pure plays are just like noise. Like they will probably, I might be wrong, but I'll probably just go away over a long period of time. Then the treasury companies that have an actual profitable business, I mean, of course, they will be around as long as their profitable business keeps going on. And if they're choosing to have Bitcoin on the treasury, something tells me that they make smart decisions in their business choices. Then the other 2 things are really interesting. Then there's like the hybrid businesses that have a business, but not a big one or not a profitable one, or like it's like a broken business and that they kind of try to revive it with Bitcoin. And strategy. How do you look at like those? Because like I go back and forth where I'm like, one day strategy will be the biggest company in the world, and then one day I'm like, I don't know if they actually like have that big of a future. But then it's like, shit, they have 600,000 Bitcoin. Yeah, I'm really torn apart on that. I want to tell you about something very special to me. It's called Microseed. If you hold your Bitcoin in self-custody, and you should, you know how critical it is to secure your seed phrase. You should not have them on paper. You should not have them on anything else than titanium. With Microseed, you can engrave your 12 or 24 word seed phrase, the entire seed phrase, onto a 1-inch small washer. Yes, just one washer. All 24 words on that one washer. You can hide that thing everywhere. And even better, you don't need to buy a new kit every time you have to get a new wallet. You can make unlimited backups because Microseed is not selling the washer. Microseed is selling the device that stamps the washer. So you get the full kit with the device, with the washers, with the hammer, with everything you need to get started today. And you can make with that unlimited amount of backups. Go now to microseed.io. Again, that's microseed.io to get your last backup tool you ever need. The most important thing for your Bitcoin journey is not buying Bitcoin, but it's how to keep them. And yes, you have maybe the right tools, but how do you actually go ahead and stick it all together so it's the most secure for you personally? Self-custody is a deeply personalized journey, and the Bitcoin way is helping you exactly finding that correct setup for you personally. They are also helping you with securing your own cybersecurity. And if you want to go one step above all that, you can even get a consultation for a Plan B residency. Go to thebitcoinway.com/Robin and you will get a 30-minute free consultation. I finally and officially mine Bitcoin. This is not just something to stack more Satoshis, but it's most importantly also to support the network. Individual miners are the ones that keep the Bitcoin network decentralized. And by the way, you get KYC-free Bitcoin. That's why I use simplemining. I get an actual proper Bitcoin miner. They set it up for me. They repair it if it breaks down. And most importantly, they let me choose the pool and even connect my own full node. I'm completely sovereign and I'm completely in control, and I can sign up with Ocean, no account needed. I just give them a Bitcoin address and then there's mining going on. No KYC, nothing. So if you're ready to mine Bitcoin, go to simplemining.io, tell them you come from Robin, and let's mine Bitcoin together.
I'd have to say I don't spend that much time thinking about it because the sort of the other side of the coin for me is I don't really want companies to hold a large amount of Bitcoin. I would prefer individuals holding a large amount of Bitcoin. I view companies holding a large amount as a similar thing to governments holding a large amount. It reduces individual freedoms and individual, capabilities. So I don't think that, I also, though I'm pragmatic and, I understand a company wants to hold it and they are going to, and I can't stop them from doing so, and I shouldn't be able to stop them from doing so. So it's the reality of the world that we live in. Companies like MicroStrategy, it is interesting because, I also don't know what their future is going to be. They are huge. They hold a lot of Bitcoin. That makes them extremely valuable and extremely, protected against, problems that could happen. But they might not be as big as a company who is doing something in the Bitcoin space and more rapidly accumulating Bitcoin through their operations rather than just through, buying it on the open market. Because, as it is, strategy doesn't earn Bitcoin, strategy buys Bitcoin. I think companies that earn Bitcoin, even if they start off slower, may end up doing much better in the long run. I'm not going to prognosticate and say that is the case. It's just, it seems to me that probably should be the case eventually.
Yeah, I think so too. It will be really interesting. Then there's also like this whole thing of like, will huge treasury companies, eventually form? Because of, if you think about it, if you have 10 Bitcoin in a Bitcoin world, this is already a lot of money. If we go in that a theory that having a world that's denominated in Bitcoin, which is mostly people use Bitcoin as their money, then 10 Bitcoin is just like an absurd amount of money to have for one person. And so I'm like, 600,000 Bitcoin, that's a central bank. that is serious kind of a money.
It is. I mean, if you take the number of people in the world and you divide it through the amount of Bitcoin that ever will exist, I don't remember the exact number, but I think it was something like 70,000 or 700,000 sats or something like that. It's it's in the tens of thousands of sats that each person would have. Now, you got to account for the fact that we live in a world with quite a lot of inequality. So there are rich people and there are poor people. There are people who will be at the much, much lower end of that. There are people who would be at the higher end of that. But regardless, anyone holding even more than one Bitcoin is absurdly wealthy in that kind of world. Somebody holding 10 Bitcoin is ridiculously wealthy, and 600,000 is just an unimaginable number, basically. But yeah, it is central bank level of wealth, because you could take that number and then divide it by the sort of average wealth of people and see how many people it covers, and absolutely that would cover a country or more. So, that puts them in the same position as any other sort of large controlling governmental entity, whether you're talking central bank. I think I'd avoid the central bank analogy because they can't print more of it. So, that makes them very different to a central bank. It makes them more like a Fort Knox or something, but somebody with control over that money. So yeah, it makes them more like some kind of governmental entity. And actually, honestly, that's something I'm always worried about with large companies is, what happens when they start acting like governments themselves. We've got the exact same problems as with governments, but with less regulation and less control over them, which is disturbing. Yeah,
if you think about it, the control that Apple has is more than most countries. Like, there's not a lot of countries that are more powerful than Apple itself.
Yeah. And now imagine a world in which the governments have even less power and Apple starts having its own private army. Apple with a private army, Microsoft with a private army, Google, or Meta, Facebook, all of these companies with their own private armies. What's the difference between that and a world of governments, other than the fact that the companies aren't democratic at all? So you've got these authoritarian kind of board of director controlled governments now. It's a scary kind of world. And I think if you read sort of a lot of classic cyberpunk type novels, so you read the likes of Snow Crash or Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, or any of the sort of those classic cyberpunk, Johnny Mnemonic, any of those sort of books, I think that was an early way of warning about this potential kind of future. And I don't think a lot of people like to say Bitcoin fixes this when talking about lots of different things. I don't think Bitcoin necessarily fixes that. It doesn't make it better or worse. I think that can happen in a fiat world or a Bitcoin world, but it's something we need to, as a society, figure out how we're going to avoid, that kind of scenario.
Do you think that Bitcoin has an impact on politics?
I think Bitcoin can't help but have an impact on politics. Bitcoin is money, and money is a very political thing. I don't think Bitcoin. So, the US always likes to talk about whether things are partisan or not. I'd say Bitcoin is definitely non-partisan. It doesn't belong to any particular political ideology, but Bitcoin is inherently political in that it's money. So it will always have an impact on it, and vice versa. Politics will always have an impact on how we view and interact with Bitcoin. I don't think politics is likely to change the rules of Bitcoin very much. I don't think politics has enough power anymore to convince enough people to change consensus rules, for example. I don't think any government could say, okay, we want the consensus rules to be changed in this way and then actually have it happen. I don't think that's realistic anymore. Maybe in the very, very early days, but definitely not now. But I do think it can change how people interact with Bitcoin, how people treat Bitcoin. The difference between how Bitcoin is often viewed in sort of the the larger Western nations. So, not all of Europe, but large parts of Europe, UK, US, Canada, Australia, Bitcoin is very much viewed as this kind of speculative asset for rich people. But then you go to parts of Central America, parts of South America, parts of Africa, parts of the South Pacific, parts of Southeast Asia. And Bitcoin is very much viewed more as a medium of exchange, a type of free money, which keeps you, outside of the system. So, very much more the cypherpunk medium of exchange kind of roots. And I think that's because of how money is treated there by governments in general. So in countries where the governments, the politics is keeping money relatively, like, we all complain about inflation, but the euro is relatively stable. The pound is relatively stable. The US dollar is relatively stable. And we don't have controls on us, where the bank all of a sudden says, no, you're not getting your money today, or you can't afford to, you're not allowed to get your money out to buy groceries, that kind of thing. That doesn't really happen to us on a daily basis, and or at least not enough that people are coming out and complaining about it. It does happen, but it's quite rare. In a lot of these other places, those are the things that people deal with on a daily basis. So Bitcoin has a different use to them, a different need from a political perspective. So I think that's how governments and politics can influence Bitcoin. The other way around, Bitcoin influencing government and politics, I think because it's money, they need to do something with it. They need to figure out how to either embrace it or fight it. And I think too many of them have been trying to fight it for too long and failing. So I think we're now kind of turning the corner, and people are moving away from the fight it and into the embrace it from the political sphere. The interesting question there is, though, how they embrace it. So again, in the sort of larger Western nations, you see the embracing of Bitcoin being more towards things like, okay, our country will have a strategic Bitcoin reserve, which really isn't all that different to a Bitcoin Treasury company kind of thing. It's just at a country level. So you've got these strategic Bitcoin reserves ideas in different countries, whereas other countries might say, oh, Bitcoin is a good medium of exchange. Let's encourage that. Let's remove the tax regulations around it that make it burdensome to use. Let's encourage the free exchange between our local currency and Bitcoin. Those kinds of things. So yeah, the opposite of fighting it is embracing it, but what kind of embracing, I think, is also very, very different and depends very much on what the rest of the world around it looks like.
There is I couldn't find it, but I saw a tweet that kind of went like, central banking made governments bigger and Bitcoin makes governments smaller. Would you tend to agree with that?
Yes to the first half, but with caveats, and I'd say actually no to the second half. Bitcoin doesn't necessarily make governments smaller. We can foresee a path whereby Bitcoin helps to make certain functions of government obsolete and therefore smaller, but I don't think it inherently necessarily has to do so, because as governments start losing power, they tend to want to regain that power. So where they lose it in one place, they might grow in size in other places. You see that a lot with sort of small government advocates who then gain power in different countries around the world. They'll slash a whole lot of government departments, but then without sort of saying anything, start increasing the size of others. Often things like military and policing and so on, because the cuts that they're making elsewhere are causing problems because they didn't turn things off nicely. They just kind of stopped things. So I think politics is a difficult game. I'm an anarchist. I dislike the idea of centralized hierarchies at all, but I think it would be disastrous to just turn off the government immediately. If we're here in the UK where I'm sitting right now, the government suddenly completely disappeared and every government official stopped doing what they do, there would be chaos. It would be absolute ridiculous violence and terror in the streets. I do want to get rid of the government, but not like that. To me, the best way is to, over time, make them obsolete by replacing them with better systems. Bitcoin is one of those systems. So, we can replace the government's ability to do things with money through a decentralized money by the people for the people, which is Bitcoin. We can do the same in other systems as well. We don't have to have a centralized Department of Education. We don't have to have a centralized system for managing transport. We don't have to have all of these large centralized systems managed by a government. We can replace them. But I don't think it makes sense to just cut them and get rid of them immediately and then, see what happens. I think we do actually have to replace them with better decentralized alternatives.
Now, you are at least the only person that I know of, only Bitcoiner that I know of, that moved from somewhere to UK and not the other way around from UK to somewhere else. I think we talked a little bit about that in the last episode, if I remember correctly. I'm not sure. Why did you move as an anarchist to the UK? I think a lot of Bitcoiner might be confused.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two things there. One, the UK, it has problems, definitely. No country is without its problems. But the UK is nowhere near as bad as social media tends to make out. If you believe social media, then, I could go on X and I could type something like, I think Keir Starmer's an idiot, and then, the police will turn up at my house and arrest me and drag me away for inciting violence or whatever. No, that doesn't actually happen. Yes, there are people arrested for making social media posts, but often those are actual things like direct threats of violence. So somebody says online, I'm going to kill you, to another person. The police follow that up and, they might arrest somebody for it. So it is not as bad as social media makes out, despite the fact that, I do think it is far overboard. I think, things like the fact that the Palestine Action has been prescribed as a terrorist organization. So, if you sit somewhere with a sign saying, I support Palestine Action, then you can and potentially will get arrested by the police as, under terrorism laws, which is insane. And that is the reality in the UK at the moment. So there are problems, but I moved away from Germany. So it's not that I was moving to the UK as such. Of course I did. I moved from Germany to the UK, but it wasn't that it was that the UK was attracting me. It's that Germany was making me want to leave. And there were a large number of reasons for that. One of them was schooling. So, I've got 2 kids, like I mentioned. Both of them are still school age, and the German school system is incredibly strict, incredibly, I would call it oppressive. And it's entirely based around the idea of turning you into a good little drone for society. It doesn't encourage creativity. It doesn't encourage free thinking. It really is just entirely set up to, turn you into somebody who's going to fit into their predestined mold of what a person in this society should be. I find that quite abhorrent. And of course, one of the first things I did when I realized how bad it was I looked into homeschooling and found out that homeschooling is completely illegal in Germany. You cannot do it under any circumstance. It's simply not allowed. Looked into a few private schools which might be better. Most of them are equally as strongly regulated by the government, so even the private schools have to follow a lot of the things that the government says. So at some point I was like, okay, this isn't okay for my kids. My kids are too important to me to allow this to happen. So I had to move somewhere which is much more open and flexible in how I can raise my kids and how I can give them a better future. So that was kind of one of the main reasons for moving away from Germany. And the destination of the UK was largely just, I work for a company which is based in the UK, and it made a lot of sense to be closer to the other people who work for the same company.
And UK is interesting because if you look at it, not from the daily politics, but from just like what they have going for them, they are a great country in terms of the time zone is great. They have the English language, which is amazing in the Western world. They don't have the borders, like they are like protected with their own island basically. And so like, if you think about a concept of a country, the UK has a lot of things that you kind of want for a prospering, great country. But it's interesting how you hear so many bad things about it. Obviously, I have no clue about it because I've not lived in the UK. Now, you are now there since 2 years, something like that?
Actually, just under 1 year. It was around February, March that I moved here. Yeah.
Oh, okay. It's a very short amount of time for for that question. So, but I will still ask it. Since you've lived in the UK, do you have the feeling that things are getting like better or worse there?
So I'd say on the short-term scale, worse, but I see a lot of potential for the future. So, no matter how you're aligned politically, I think this is interesting times in the UK because the mainstream parties, the ones who always kind of got all of the votes and the other parties were just like the little parties who never got any, those mainstream parties are decreasing in popularity and the little ones are getting much more popular. So on the political right, you've got Reform. They are much, much more popular than they used to be, and I think they are more popular than the traditional Conservative Party. And on the left, you've got the Greens, who used to be this tiny little party, but they are now, getting much more popular than Labour or the Liberal Democrats. So you've got these previously small parties gaining a lot of interest and a lot of power compared to what they did. So, regardless of what happens, there is going to be change. It could be change in one direction, it could be change in another direction, but it's going to be change either way. It's going to be significant change, as the old guard kind of, disappears and the new guys come in and start to shake things up a lot more.
It's actually interesting because in Austria, I've seen the same thing. So up until the last 10, 20 years, it has changed. But before that, there was basically two parties, one from the Social Democratic and one from the Conservative. Like those are two, similar than this two-party system of America. Now we have 5 parties in the parliament and we have 3 parties in the government. So we have a 3-party system in the government, which makes also a lot of problems because obviously they have to agree on everything and it tends to being the least amount of change, because the big thing is kind of hard because then they see a sellout to the voters. But it's interesting because I've noticed one thing. There's those the parties that are really critical of the EU inside of the EU seems to be gaining a lot of popularity in the last couple of years, which is interesting, especially when we talk about the UK, because the UK actually exited the EU, and I think the same people that wanted the Brexit are the same people that are really not happy with where the UK is going as a sense. It's all people were the EU is the problem for everything, and now it's it seems to be even worse. It's just the perspective I have from the internet. I've not even visited the UK the past couple of I was in Ireland, I guess, but not really there. But how do you view of that? I mean, you weren't there, so you also had more of an outside view. But I'm just interested in how the exit of the EU and the people that wish for that are kind of coinciding with what they're actually getting when we look at the first example of the Brexit.
No, I think that is fairly accurate. The people who were, pushing for it the loudest are also the people who are complaining the loudest about how things are now. But I think that's often not so much a case of, that these people have changed their mind or anything like that. I think it just tends to be there are certain groups of people who will be more likely to complain about things than others, loudly, and they want to find some kind of scapegoat. So the UK had a traditionally conservative government for a very long time, and then just relatively recently switched to the Labour government, who are, I would say, terrible. Is probably a good way to put it. But they should, in theory, be different than the Conservative government. But really, almost everything they've been doing is the exact same kind of stuff. So nothing was really getting better. It's just been kind of getting steadily worse. It hasn't gotten much worse, or it hasn't turned around and gotten better. It's essentially just been the same path that things were already on. And I think for those who are in favor of the left side of the political spectrum, they would generally say, we are disappointed that they didn't turn everything around. We're blaming them, but we're also blaming the conservatives before who were doing just as bad a job. But then you've got the people on the political right who are saying, look, the Labour government came in and look, everything is terrible, without saying, hold on, the conservatives were already on that path to begin with. So I think that's why, though, you're getting this kind of push towards the other two more extreme ends. So, with the Reform on the extreme right and the Greens on the extreme left, you've got those parties gaining a lot more power because I think the veil has been lifted and people see that, the traditional old guard left and right really aren't that different. They are basically just the same party in two different forms. There's no significant difference in the policies or the behavior of these parties. So it'd be interesting to see what then happens. Just because, like I said, I think it is going to be a pretty big shake-up when either of those other parties, whether it's Reform or the Greens, get into power. Brexit is an interesting thing there because a lot of the people involved in Reform were the people pushing strongly for Brexit. And there are enough people who would support them and say, Brexit isn't the reason for all of these problems. We were already on a path to falling apart before Brexit, and the path has just continued. Brexit didn't solve things, but it didn't make anything worse. And then you've got people on the other side, the kind of people who would probably vote for the Greens, who say Brexit was the worst decision ever. Look how bad the country has become since Brexit. Let's figure out a path to rejoin the EU. So that is one of the Greens' policies, that they would like to rejoin the EU. We don't know what that would look like or anything else, but that is one of the policies there. So there are at least people talking about, hey, a huge mistake was made. Can we fix it? Meanwhile, there are other people saying, no, it wasn't a mistake. It was the right thing to do.
It's so interesting when you think about politics, and it's also frustrating. Think about the concept. How do you actually, it's mostly also coming from Americans, and it's funny because I feel like, Elon Musk once posted that meme that the European countries love governments and regulations so much they have a government regulation for the governments, and I find it funny because I'm like, isn't that what the United States also is, like the federal government? And even more so, like there's a lot more freedoms than the EU countries have than what the states in America have, and like the voting rights and like the thing that one country in the EU can block things and on all of those things. So I find it funny because most of those things come from America. But do you see the EU as something bad because it tries to centralize power even more, and Europe with a more decentralized kind of like setting would be maybe better?
I think there's an interesting paradox that comes in when you're talking about size of government. A lot of the time people say, we want to get rid of the large centralized entities. So, even go back to the US as an example. They say, remove the power from the federal government and increase states' rights. Give the states more power to decide things on their own. But the smaller you make government, the more authoritarian they are capable of being in a lot of circumstances. Let's just take it to an extreme example. Imagine, my street, the street that I live on, now has a local government who have absolute power over the people who live in the street. It's very, very easy to imagine some absolutely horrific things happening. If over 50% of the people who live on my street are, let's say, racist, and there's one person who lives on the street who is not from this country, such as myself, there could be issues there for that one person compared to the rest. The larger the government is, the less of those kinds of authoritarian things are capable of happening. So that doesn't necessarily mean I'm a fan of large government. I'm not. As I mentioned before, I'm an anarchist. But you kind of see this interesting dichotomy between the size of government and the capability to be extremely authoritarian. I think devolving things to a small size while maintaining the same structures is inherently dangerous. I think that is actually what leads to a lot of problems. So in that context, I would say I like the fact that the EU is able to make sure that European countries all act relatively similarly with regard to their laws, and that nobody's going to go out and do some absolutely crazy shit and kind of cause problems. But on the other side of the coin, the EU then does things like create regulations that kind of get pushed out into national laws against potentially the will of the vast majority of the people in those individual countries. And that can cause other kinds of issues. So I'm not saying it's necessarily good or bad. I think it's got good and bad aspects to it. I think a better approach is actually, again, sort of that bottom-up decentralized approach, whereby instead of saying, let's have all of these different organizations but change the amount of power that each one of them has in relation to each other, instead I prefer a system whereby you've got small, localized agreements between individuals, which then make agreements with other groups of individuals near them, who make agreements with other groups of individuals near them, and the larger scale politics becomes an emergent property out of smaller scale interactions. So things like the concept of countries disappears under that. You've got certain groups of people who have reasons to be interacting with each other, usually due to physical locality, but it could even be, virtual locality, groups of people online who have similar reasons to interact with each other and make agreements with each other. But you've got these sort of localized syndicated groups. So the general concept is based around something called syndicalism. And that, I think, is a far better way to organize people. That said, I don't think it's practical or implementable in the world that we have right now. I don't think there is any way we can go from what we are now to that in any kind of reasonable time frame without everything kind of falling apart first. I would hope to be wrong on that, but I don't think I am. So a better question becomes then, how do we approximate that inside the systems that we have at the moment? And that brings us back to things like Bitcoin, whereby we essentially have decentralized systems that we have control over outside of government control and are capable of using it whether they want us to or not, kind of thing.
I was wondering if I should go into this, but I'm just so curious what you think about on the core versus nodes thing now, because it is the government talks reminding me that with the consensus building, all of that. But I love your view on politics, because it's very refreshing in Bitcoin. I think it's not always in Bitcoin, I hear a lot about let's destroy government and let's just let rule by Bitcoin. And I'm like, I don't know if A, it's possible, and B, it's a good thing. It's probably better to let it be developed in the longer time organically and slowly. And it's very hard for me to say that, because I really am not a friend of governments, as probably most Bitcoiners are. But yeah, and to the core versus nodes things, I think the topic overall has been beaten up to death. To this point, it's still interesting for some reason. The one thing I'm now wondering is if there actually will be a soft fork. That's the only interesting question for me now at that point. Core 30 has been quite I don't want to say successful, but if from rolling out, how people adopted it, coming from the node side, more successful than they thought it will be probably, but still nodes is huge, and has been growing quite substantially. Maybe how do you currently view the state of that, and do you think that there is coming a soft fork, and can this software fork actually do what they want to do, and even if it might be good or bad for Bitcoin?
Yeah, there's kind of a lot of different paths to take with that line of questioning. So, overall, I think that the idea behind the Knott's objections to Core 30 are wrong. I think that it's not technically possible to stop spam, and the more you try to stop it, the worse it gets. And I don't mean worse as in more of it, I mean worse as in the way in which the data gets embedded on the chain. So people are going to want to embed stuff on the chain regardless. And the way that they do it can either be easy to deal with or difficult to deal with. And the more you stop the easy ways to deal with it, the more it becomes difficult to deal with. So overall, I think the that approach from Knott's is kind of wrong. I think BIP 444 is an embodiment of that that bad line of thinking. I think it will, like, if it soft forks, and as to whether it will or not, if you had asked me 2 weeks ago, I would have said no, there will be no soft fork. If you ask me now, there is a chance of it, but I'm still trending towards no. I kind of hope there isn't, but if there is, okay, it'll happen. If there is a soft fork, I really don't think either side of the chain will be free of spam. I think both sides will just continue to get spammed in different ways. So the only way to really counter spam is to outbid it on the fee market. You need to pay more fees than the spammer is willing to pay to embed his junk on the chain. That's unfortunately just a side effect of having a completely open network. I don't want cat pictures on chain. I think it's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous use of block space, but I don't get to make that decision. Whoever is paying for the block space is the one who is making that decision.
I love that. It's really interesting. I wish I would have put you and Knut together on one day. Because we just talked about that, and weirdly enough, I think like most people, if they think about the core versus Knott's debate, I mean, I'm biased because I know you both so good. They think about like maybe Mechanic and Jameson Lobb and like other people that are like on that scene. But man, I would love like a Knut and Ben topic, because for me, you both are really great Bitcoiners and have a different stance on that. So like, I don't know if we come to soft fork material, maybe we can set that up one day if the debate is interesting enough. One question that I asked each and every one of my, as we are already coming, almost overlooked the time, as we're already coming closer to the end of the podcast, one question that I asked each and every one of my returning guests, and you are now technically the third time here, but I only count if you are alone, so like the second time on the podcast. And the question is, what have you learned outside of Bitcoin since your last appearance on the podcast?
A lot of Spanish. So I've been learning Spanish recently. Still not particularly good at it. And the older I get, the harder it gets to learn new languages, which is kind of a shame because linguistics is a hobby of mine. I speak like 4 or 5, depending on how you count, reasonably fluently, but my Spanish is still absolutely terrible, and it's taking me much longer to learn than I would have liked. But that's kind of the main thing I've been spending my time learning outside of the Bitcoin world.
Really interesting. And as you know, I'm learning Hindi at the moment, and it's freaking hard. But
at least it's still an Indo-European language.
And what Indo-European language?
Yes. So
what is that?
It's still very distantly related to English, German, French, Latin, Greek. It's so it is theoretically still going to be easier than learning something like Korean or Vietnamese or Japanese, which are in a totally different set of language families.
I use an app called Pimsleur. I love that app. It really fastly gets you going with speaking. Like those Duolingo things and the other apps, like they don't work at all for me. And Pimsleur works really nice because they talk to you and then you talk back. And so while you're learning, you constantly talk. And then you're actually like, after like 1-2 hours of learning, you're like, hey, I can have like a small mini conversation. I actually know how to speak. And with all the other apps, you put like 100 hours in there and you're like, I cannot even speak a sentence.
Yeah, I like using a combination of things. So, I do use Duolingo, but I wouldn't rely only on it. I think doing that would be a mistake. So yeah, I like to try to consume a lot of media and then, as much as possible, use the language as well. So, I was in El Salvador just, a week or so ago, and, I used as much of my limited Spanish as I could.
Salvador is a great place for that. Yeah. Really cool. We have an end routine in the podcast where the previous guest is asking a question for the next guest without knowing who the next guest actually is. And the previous guest questions asked you the question, if you could pick one big thing to happen in Bitcoin in the next 12 months, what would that be?
Activation of some kind of covenants, and at this point I don't really care which covenants implementation, but we need covenants in order to do a lot of the other cool stuff that we need to be doing.
I also hear that a lot from people that the core versus not thing is a distraction from governance.
Yeah.
It takes away breath from there. Thank you so much, Ben, for being on the podcast, for being such a great guest. It was really interesting speaking with you. Before I let you go, where can people find you? And oh gosh, we didn't talk about Musket at all, but like the company Musket, the thing that you're doing also.
Yep, so you can find me on most social media just with my name, Ben Deval. So on X, for example, it's Ben_Deval, DEWAAL. The company I work for, I'm CTO at Musket. Musket.tech is our web address. We make payment systems. There was a good one of Robin's podcast a few months ago with myself and a couple of my colleagues talking about what Musket is. So if you're interested in payment systems, take a look at that. It's been a pleasure being on.
Thank you so much. And also thank you so much for everyone that is watching and listening, for joining us today. As always, I'll be back tomorrow with another episode. Bye-bye. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial advice.